Forget Leonardo DiCaprio. Forget The Revenant. As brutal as that movie was, the true story of Hugh Glass makes Hollywood look like a bedtime story. This is a man who cheated death so many times that it's a wonder he didn't just spit in the Grim Reaper's face. Pirates, cannibals, Native Americans, grizzly bears, maggots eating his flesh alive, and a revenge quest that never actually delivered. Hugh Glass's life was one long fever dream of survival against impossible odds. But before we get to the part where he's crawling hundreds of miles through hostile territory, with his back literally rotting, we need to talk about where he came from. Hugh Glass didn't cut his teeth on the frontier like you'd expect from a mountain man. No, Hugh's first real taste of danger came on the high seas, and it wasn't long before he got forced into one of the worst career paths imaginable: piracy. Hugh Glass was born around 1783, somewhere near Scranton, Pennsylvania, to Scotch-Irish immigrant parents. Like a lot of young men back then, he wound up working at sea. It was a hard life, but it was about to get a whole lot harder when his ship crossed paths with the infamous French pirate Jean Lafitte. If you've never heard of Lafitte, think of him as the Gulf of Mexico's version of Blackbeard, minus the flaming beard, but just as dangerous. When Lafitte's men boarded Hugh's vessel, Glass was given a choice: die right there or become a pirate. And Hugh, not being stupid, chose piracy over immediate execution. It wasn't a career move so much as a survival tactic. For the next 2 years, Glass was forced into Lafitte's bloody world of raiding, murdering, and looting. Everything that pirates do when they're not drinking rum and making parrot jokes. Now, if Hollywood were writing this story, this is where we'd cue up a jaunty sea shanty and show Hugh reluctantly going along until he eventually wins the crew's respect. But reality was way uglier. By his own later accounts, Glass absolutely hated piracy. He described it as being cut off from honor and compassion, surrounded by daily atrocities and cruelty that shocked even him. And keep in mind, this is a guy who would later eat raw buffalo meat with maggots crawling through his wounds. If Hugh Glass thought piracy was worse, you can imagine just how bad it was. Eventually, Hugh had enough. While anchored off the Texas coast, back when it was still Spanish territory, Glass made his escape. He and another poor soul, who'd also had his fill of piracy, jumped ship, swam to shore, and struck out into the wilderness, which, by the way, was not exactly the Hilton. The coastline they washed up on was Karankawa territory, a tribe with a fierce reputation and some very nasty rumors about cannibalism. Whether or not the cannibal stories were exaggerated, Glass didn't have the luxury of fact-checking. He had to get moving. He and his companion trekked northward through some of the roughest land in North America, without maps, without supplies, and with the constant knowledge that the locals might decide they'd make a decent snack. And just when they thought they'd made it out alive, they stumbled into even bigger trouble. Somewhere in present-day Kansas or Nebraska, the two escapees were captured by a band of Pawnee. Hugh had escaped Jean Lafitte's cutthroats and dodged cannibals, but this time, there was no running. The Pawnee immediately executed his companion in the most gruesome way imaginable, hanging him upside down, shoving pine needles into his skin, and setting him on fire. Hugh's turn was coming next, but Glass, ever the survivor, had one thing up his sleeve: a packet of vermilion dye. It was a prized trade good, perfect for war paint, and the Pawnee valued it enough to spare him. Instead of ending up as another Human Torch, Hugh Glass was adopted into the tribe. He lived with them for about 2 years, learning their language, their ways, and even taking a wife. From pirate captive to Pawnee tribesman, Hugh Glass was already living a life more insane than most men could imagine. And this was before the grizzly bear ever even entered the story. When Hugh Glass found himself adopted into the Pawnee, his life took a hard left turn. One day, he's a shipwrecked fugitive crawling away from Jean Lafitte's pirate empire. The next, he's part of a Native American community in the heart of the Great Plains. And unlike his time among the pirates, this wasn't slavery or coercion. With the Pawnee, Hugh became something else entirely: family. He lived with the tribe for about 2 years, long enough to not just survive, but to belong. He learned the language, hunted with them, went on raids, and even took a wife. This wasn't the caricature of the white man held captive you sometimes see in dime novels. It was genuine adoption, the kind that wasn't uncommon among tribes of the plains. For Hugh, it meant a crash course in the wilderness survival: how to track game, how to read the land, how to live without the conveniences of the civilized world. Skills that, as it turns out, would keep him alive later in ways that defy belief. Eventually, though, Hugh parted ways with the Pawnee. The reasons aren't recorded, and maybe that's because there wasn't one dramatic reason at all. Maybe he was restless. Maybe the pull of St. Louis and its booming trade called him back. Or maybe Hugh was just the type of man who couldn't sit still for too long. Either way, by the early 1820s, he was drifting back into the orbit of a new industry that was rapidly transforming the West: the fur trade. In February 1822, an ad appeared in the Missouri Gazette, placed by none other than General William Henry Ashley. Ashley was recruiting 100 enterprising young men to ascend the Missouri River and make a fortune trapping beaver pelts. These would become known as Ashley's 100, and among them were names that would one day become legends of the frontier: Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and of course Hugh Glass. Beaver pelts at the time were like gold. High fashion in Europe and the United States demanded felt hats made from beaver fur, and as long as wealthy gentlemen in London and New York wanted to look sharp, there was money to be made. The trade lured all sorts of men westward. Some desperate for work, some chasing adventure, others just plain crazy. Glass was no greenhorn. By this point, he'd already survived piracy, escaped cannibals, and lived with the Pawnee. He was fluent in their language, familiar with their sign talk, and could live off the land with the best of them. Compared to the teenage Bridger, who was still wet behind the ears, Hugh Glass was a seasoned veteran. That made him an invaluable recruit. Ashley's men pushed upriver, deep into the land of the Arikara, better known as the Ree. These people had been semi-nomadic farmers for centuries, growing corn, beans, and squash in the fertile river valleys. They also had a long memory, and relations with white traders were already strained. It didn't take long for tensions to turn bloody. In June of 1823, Ashley's party was attacked in what became known as the Arikara War. In just minutes, arrows and musket balls cut down 14 trappers, with many more wounded. Hugh himself took a hit in the leg. In a rare surviving letter to the father of one of the dead, Glass described how his friend lived a little while after he was shot and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. That letter is one of the only first-hand writings we have from Hugh Glass, and it paints a vivid picture of just how treacherous this work was. The survivors regrouped and counterattacked, even burning one of the Ree villages to the ground. For Glass, it was one more brush with death, but it also meant that by the time he and a small party of survivors headed west toward the Yellowstone, he was carrying more than just a rifle and traps. He was carrying a running tab of violence, betrayal, and survival that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. And that's when Hugh Glass made the mistake that would make him a legend. Wandering just a little too far ahead of the party, he stumbled into a grizzly bear's and her cubs. It was late summer, 1823. Hugh Glass was moving with a small party of men under Andrew Henry, one of Ashley's business partners, pushing northwest toward the Yellowstone country. They were already worn thin, attacked by Arikara, slowed by shortages of horses, and constantly looking over their shoulders for hostile war parties. Every step deeper into the wilderness was a gamble. That's when Glass, the seasoned frontiersman, did what seasoned frontiersmen were expected to do. He went out ahead of the group to hunt for meat. It should have been routine, but instead of deer or elk, Hugh Glass walked straight into the worst possible nightmare: a mother grizzly bear with 2 cubs. Now, a bear on her own is dangerous enough, but a sow with cubs, that's a guaranteed fight. And unlike in the movies, there's no dramatic pause, no slow motion stare down. One moment Glass was stalking quietly through the brush. The next, he was being hit by what amounted to a half-ton freight train covered in fur, teeth, and claws. The bear hit him hard and fast, knocking him off his feet before he could even think about running. Her claws ripped through his flesh, tearing chunks from his back and his side. Her jaws clamped onto his throat, shredding his windpipe so badly that he was literally breathing through the holes in his neck. And while she mauled him, her cubs joined in, scratching, biting, tearing at him as if he were nothing more than another carcass in the woods. Glass fought back as best he could, stabbing with his knife, swinging his rifle. Some accounts even suggest he got a shot off, but whether or not he managed to wound the bear himself, it didn't matter. By the time his fellow trappers reached him, drawn by the sound of the struggle, Hugh Glass was a mangled heap of blood and torn flesh, and the bear was finally dead. What those men found wasn't a man so much as a corpse that hadn't gotten the memo. His body was shredded from head to toe. His throat was torn open. His leg was broken. His ribs cracked. The flesh on his back was hanging in ribbons. By all rights, Hugh Glass should have been dead then and there, but he wasn't. Somehow, impossibly, he was still alive, breathing shallow, ragged breaths, eyes flickering, barely conscious, but alive. The men were horrified. They did what they could with the crude medicine of the day, bandaging his wounds, setting bones as best they could, but everyone knew he was finished. The best anyone expected was that he'd die by morning. But Hugh Glass didn't die. Not that night, not the next night, not the night after that. And the longer he clung to life, the bigger problem he became. You see, this wasn't a world where you could call for a medevac helicopter or even toss him on a wagon bound for town. They were in the middle of hostile country on foot and moving slowly enough as it was. Carrying a man who was, at best, 98% dead slowed them to a crawl. And every extra hour they lingered was another chance for the Arikar or Blackfeet to catch up and finish what the bear had started. Henry made the call. He had his men fashion a stretcher, and for 2 days they carried Glass, hoping against hope that he'd die soon and spare them the trouble. But Hugh refused to quit breathing. Finally, Henry had no choice. He offered an $80 bonus, $2,000 in today's money, to any 2 men willing to stay behind with Glass until he died and bury him properly. 2 stepped forward. One was John Fitzgerald, an older, seasoned trapper. The other was a teenager, still green and barely more than a boy. Jim Bridger. Yes, that Jim Bridger, the same one who'd later become one of the most famous mountain men in history. The rest of the party moved on. Fitzgerald and Bridger stayed behind, expecting Glass to die within hours, but hours turned into days. For 5 long days, the 2 men sat in the wilderness with a man who refused to let go of life, each passing moment putting them in more danger of discovery by hostile warriors. Finally, Fitzgerald made the decision. He and Bridger would leave, but they wouldn't just leave Glass. They stripped him of everything: his rifle, his knife, his fire kit, his gear. Tools meant the difference between life and death on the frontier. They dragged his broken body down by a creek, abandoned him, and caught up with the main party. Hugh Glass was supposed to be dead. Even Fitzgerald and Bridger, who'd looked him in the eyes, believed he had no chance. And really, who could blame them? By all logic, all reason, Hugh Glass was finished. But Hugh Glass wasn't finished, not by a long shot. So there Hugh Glass lay, dumped beside a creek in the middle of hostile country, stripped of everything that might keep him alive. No rifle, no knife, no fire kit. Just the shredded rags of his clothes and a body that looked more like a butchered carcass than a man. He couldn't walk. He could barely move, and most of his bones and muscles were either broken or shredded. Even Fitzgerald and Bridger had assumed they were leaving him to a mercifully quick death. But Hugh Glass didn't die. At first, he could do nothing more than sip water from the creek and eat whatever berries he could reach without lifting more than an arm. Days passed in this state. His wounds festered. His back became a living feast for maggots, which sounds horrifying because it is, but ironically may have saved his life. By eating the dead flesh, they kept infection from spreading. Imagine that. Your body being eaten alive by bugs, and somehow that's the best case scenario. Eventually, Hugh regained just enough strength to move, not walk, crawl, dragging himself inch by agonizing inch across the prairie, pulling his broken body over rocks, through brush, through the endless grasslands of South Dakota. His destination, Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River, roughly 250 miles away. Think about that number, 250 miles. That's a long drive in a modern car on paved highways. For Hugh, it was a hellscape of crawling, limping, and sheer willpower. At first, it was literally crawling, face in the dirt, dragging himself forward. Some days he covered only a mile or two, collapsing at night with no fire to keep warm, shivering under the open sky. He ate insects, roots, and whatever he could scavenge with his bare hands. Once, he came across a pack of wolves feasting on a freshly killed buffalo calf. He scared them off, God knows how, and tore into the raw carcass with his bare hands, eating like an animal until his belly was full. Another time, he stumbled into an abandoned native village and found a few stray dogs left behind. He killed one and ate it raw. It wasn't gourmet, but it was protein, and it gave him just enough strength to keep moving. Slowly, painfully, his body began to heal. He managed to stand, hobble, and eventually limp. His back was still an open, maggot-infested wound, but he kept it clean in rivers and streams as best he could. Piece by piece, mile by mile, Hugh Glass clawed his way back to life. Then, finally, a stroke of mercy. A band of Sioux stumbled across him. Friendly, at least in this instance, they tended his wounds, gave him food, and even stitched a piece of bear hide onto his back to cover the gaping hole left by the grizzly's claws. They put him in a canoe and floated him part of the way downriver. From there, Hugh pushed on, stumbling through prairie and forest until, weeks later, he staggered through the gates of Fort Kiowa. It had been 6 weeks since the bear attack. 6 weeks of crawling, limping, bleeding, starving, freezing, and clinging to life by sheer willpower. 6 weeks to travel 250 miles through one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. And when Hugh Glass finally arrived at Fort Kiowa, he didn't collapse in relief. He didn't break down or decide to retire to a quiet farm. No, he had unfinished business because 2 men had left him for dead. One was a green kid, Jim Bridger, who didn't know better, but the other was John Fitzgerald. And for 6 straight weeks of agony, Hugh Glass's mind had focused on one thing, and one thing only: revenge. By the time Hugh Glass stumbled into Fort Kiowa, he was a walking corpse who somehow refused to stay dead. Most men in his condition would have begged for a warm bed and retirement. Not Glass. He had unfinished business. 2 names burned in his mind: Fitzgerald and Bridger, the men who had stripped him of his rifle, his knife, his powder and shot, and left him to die. In the code of the frontier, that was worse than murder. A rifle wasn't just a weapon, it was your lifeline. Without it, you might as well be unarmed and naked in a war zone. For 6 straight weeks of crawling, bleeding, and starving, Glass had focused on one goal: vengeance. And now at Fort Kiowa, he started preparing for it. He joined up with a party of traders heading upriver, borrowing a rifle and supplies on credit, determined to track down the men who had betrayed him. But this is Hugh Glass we're talking about, so of course his journey didn't go smoothly. The first group he traveled with was wiped out by Arikara warriors. Once again, Hugh found himself alone in the wilderness. Once again, he walked away from carnage when everyone else lay dead. By this point, it was starting to feel like a pattern. If Hugh Glass was in your company, odds were you'd end up scalped, burned, or shot, while he somehow limped away, breathing through holes in his neck. Glass pushed on, surviving yet another brush with the Arikara, until he finally made it to Fort Henry, the very place Fitzgerald and Bridger were supposed to be. And sure enough, when he limped through the gates, he found one of them waiting. Jim Bridger. Now remember, Bridger was just a teenager when he'd left Glass behind, a boy pressured into it by the older, more seasoned Fitzgerald. When Glass confronted him, the kid was terrified. He expected the worst. But Hugh Glass, staring down the man who had left him to die, decided to show mercy. Maybe it was because Bridger was young. Maybe it was because Glass knew what it felt like to be caught between life and death, with no good choices. Whatever the reason, he forgave him. But Fitzgerald was another story. That man had known better. He'd been the leader of the two, the one who made the decision to abandon Glass, the one who walked away with his prized rifle. For Fitzgerald, there would be no forgiveness. So Glass bided his time. Harsh winter weather pinned him down at the fort for months. But when the thaw came, he set out again, determined to find Fitzgerald and settle the score. He endured more hardships along the way, battles with hostile warriors, ambushes, and more miles on foot than most of us will walk in a lifetime. At one point, he even walked another 400 miles, with little more than a knife and fire kit, because apparently crawling 250 hadn't been enough. Finally, he reached Fort Atkinson, where Fitzgerald was stationed. Glass stormed in, ready for the showdown that he'd been building toward for nearly a year. But there was a problem. Fitzgerald wasn't just a fur trapper anymore. He had joined the United States Army, which meant he was no longer just a man. He was government property. Killing him would mean the gallows for Glass. So after months of crawling through a maggot-infested hell, after fighting wolves for a buffalo carcass, after walking hundreds of miles and surviving more brushes with death than anyone could count, Hugh Glass's grand quest for vengeance fizzled out in the most anticlimactic way possible. No epic duel, no bloody showdown, no Hollywood revenge speech. Instead, an officer at the fort returned the Glass's rifle, gave him a little cash for his trouble, and told him to move on. Fitzgerald lived. And that was it. Hugh Glass had clawed his way back from the grave not to avenge a murdered son, like in the Revenant, but to reclaim his rifle and maybe get some payback. And when he finally got there, the army stepped in and said, "Nope. What do you do after something like that? If you're Hugh Glass, you don't retire, you don't write a memoir, and you don't fade quietly into obscurity. You go back to trapping. You go back to the wilderness. You go back to the same brutal, unforgiving life that almost killed you the first dozen times." Because by then, Hugh Glass didn't know how to live any other way. After the whole fiasco with Fitzgerald and the army, most men would have called it quits. Not Hugh Glass. If anything, he seemed incapable of living a normal life. The frontier was his home, danger was his constant companion, and near-death experiences were just another Tuesday. Glass went right back to trapping and hunting, working out of forts along the upper Missouri. He roamed through what's now the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming, prime beaver country at the time. He also took on work as a hunter for trading posts, supplying meat. At Fort Union, he supposedly killed so many bighorn sheep across the river that the cliffs became known as Glass Bluffs. That's how much of a mark this guy left on the landscape. Entire landmarks bore his name, simply because he killed that much game there. Even in his 50s, Glass was still at it. He attended Rendezvous, those massive mountain man trade fairs where trappers would sell pelts, restock supplies, and spend weeks drinking, gambling, and swapping stories that were probably only half true at best. By then, Glass wasn't just another trapper. He was a living legend, a man who had crawled 250 miles half dead and lived to tell about it. But even legends run out of luck. In the spring of 1833, Hugh Glass was out trapping with two companions near the frozen Yellowstone River in what's now Montana. They weren't far from Fort Cass, a brand new trading post. By all accounts, it should have been a routine outing, but in the frontier, routine often ended in blood. A band of Arikara warriors ambushed them. Yes, the same tribe Glass had clashed with a decade earlier. The same people whose attacks had shaped much of his life on the plains. The three trappers never stood a chance. Out in the open, cut off from help, they were overwhelmed, killed, and scalped. That was the end of Hugh Glass. After years of escaping death at the jaws of pirates, cannibals, and grizzlies, it was finally arrows and knives that did him in. He died as he had lived, on the edge of civilization, with his rifle in his hands, in hostile country. According to later accounts, the local Crow mourned him deeply. Glass had lived among them, traded with them, and been respected. When the word of his death spread, Crow men and women wept, cut off fingers in grief, and offered tokens into his grave. That's how much this scarred, grizzled mountain man was loved on the frontier. In the end, Hugh Glass's life didn't close with Hollywood fireworks. There was no final duel, no poetic speech, no music swelling as the credits rolled. He simply died the way countless mountain men did, violently far from home, and remembered mostly by those who lived alongside him. But unlike most of them, his story survived, passed from trapper to trapper, written down decades later, retold, reimagined, and eventually immortalized in film. A man who should have been just another forgotten casualty of the fur trade, instead became one of America's most enduring wilderness legends. If you've seen The Revenant, you know the broad strokes. Hugh Glass gets mauled by a bear, left for dead, and claws his way back through hell to seek revenge. That part's true enough, but Hollywood, being Hollywood, couldn't resist punching it up. In the movie, Glass has a son, a half-Pawnee boy murdered by Fitzgerald. That murder becomes the emotional engine for the entire story, driving Leonardo DiCaprio's character through the snow on his vengeance quest. It's dramatic, it's tragic, and it makes for a powerful performance. But here's the reality. Hugh Glass never had a son like that. His quest wasn't about avenging family. It was about survival, and ultimately, about a rifle. That's right. The whole story that launched 1,000 think pieces and won DiCaprio his first Oscar boiled down to a man wanting his gear back. And when he finally confronted the guy who'd wronged him, he didn't get a climactic showdown. He got told by an army officer, "Hands off. Move along." Talk about anticlimactic. The movie also glosses over just how insane the crawl really was. Sure, it shows Glass staggering through the wilderness, but the film leaves out the raw dog meat, the maggot-infested wounds, and the wolves he scared off to gnaw on a half-eaten buffalo. Hollywood gave us snow-drenched hallucinations. The real Hugh Glass gave us survival so brutal, it makes Bear Grylls look like he's on a luxury camping trip. So here's the bottom line. The Revenant gave us a gripping, beautiful, and heavily fictionalized revenge tale. But the true story of Hugh Glass is stranger, grittier, and, frankly, harder to believe. A man mauled to ribbons, abandoned without food or weapon, who crawled 250 miles through enemy country just to live. And then, when denied vengeance, shrugged, picked up his rifle, and went back to trapping, until the day the frontier finally caught up with him. The movie gave us a legend. Reality gave us a man too stubborn to die. And in the end, that's what makes Hugh Glass unforgettable. And that's the real story of Hugh Glass, not Leonardo DiCaprio's snow-drenched hallucinations, not some Hollywood revenge fantasy, but the flesh and blood mountain man who crawled through maggots, wolves, and 250 miles of hostile wilderness just to prove that he was too damn stubborn to die. He didn't get his big duel. He didn't get his revenge. What he got was something rarer: survival, respect, and a place in the lore of the American frontier. Pirates, cannibals, bears, and betrayal. Glass faced it all, and in the end, the only thing that could stop him was the very wilderness that had shaped his life. So the next time you hear somebody talking about the Revenant, remember, the movie was brutal, but the truth was even stranger. If you like this dive into history's grittiest survival story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around, because there are plenty more tales out there of outlaws, lawmen, warriors, and wanderers that you won't find in your school textbooks. And trust me, some of them are every bit as insane as Hugh Glass. Thanks for watching. And if you're ever out in grizzly country, maybe keep your rifle close. You never know when you'll need it.